Welcome back to our study of the book of Esther. As you can see, today we will be looking at Esther chapter 2, the second half of it, verses 12 to 23. And the title in your booklets is Prepared for Presentation. And as we move along through the book, we are now getting to the point where Esther becomes queen of Persia. And quite an amazing event, quite an amazing scenario has led up to this point. And then, of course, things will even get more intense as we go along. A great, amazing story, a great story concerning the salvation of the Jews. And anytime we have an example of the Jews being saved, delivered from Egypt, or in this case, delivered from the edict that would have exterminated them throughout the Persian Empire. It's a little bit of a picture of God's saving spiritual Israel, God's salvation for all people in Jesus Christ. And so, just an amazing story we have here in this book. Our booklets divide this chapter into three sections: the procedures, simply in the three verses 12 through 14. And then Esther's turn in verses 15 to 18. And this is when she goes before the king and she does become queen. And so pretty amazing. She, through this whole process, has been one who stood out, one that people noticed, and obviously for her looks, but obviously in addition to her looks, she handled herself well and went through this whole process in an amazing way. And then the last part of this chapter, Mordecai hears about a plot against the king. He reports it to Esther. Esther reports it to the king, and it is noted, is really what we get to here. Mordecai is noted as one who told the truth about this plot and found out about it and was willing to keep the king from facing the consequences of this plot against him. So, important little subtext here at the end of chapter 2. All right, well, let's look at our introduction. And last week we looked at more of the story of Joseph. The introduction in our booklets for this lesson also just notes how amazing it is that Esther is in the position that she's in to be able to deliver her people. And of course, Joseph was put in the position he was through hard times, being sold into slavery, being put in prison, et cetera, et cetera. And he was able to deliver not just the Jews, but the Egyptians. He was able to set things up where everyone did not pass away because of the famine. He stored up grain ahead of time and saved the country he was in, but also his people who came to get grain, particularly his family, of course. And so we just notice once again Joseph's great attitude concerning everything that happened to him. This is right near the end of the whole book of Genesis, and Joseph says to his brothers, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God?" The very important statement. We mentioned it last week a little bit, but if we make ourselves God, then we make ourselves idols. We put our faith in self as opposed to in God. And Joseph's just pointing out, I'm not going to be the judge. I'm not going to be the evaluator. I'm not going to be the one to punish you if that is what is deserved, because I'm not God. And then he points out the truth of the matter. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today. Joseph realized that sometimes there's a bigger picture. And that is a good thing for us to remember as well as we go through this life. Some of the things that people struggle through, some of the trials, temptations, just calamities that take place in this life, some of them build someone's strength up to be able to handle something in the future or to be able to help others. Joseph being sold into slavery led to his family being saved. And of course, it's through his family that Jesus Christ came. So there's even a bigger picture of this. And then same with Esther, the trials that she had to go through, the struggles that the Jews had in the time of Haman there in Persia. Um, these things took place, and she was put in a position where she was able to deliver her people. Verse 21 of Genesis 50, to wrap up this paragraph here. So do not fear, Joseph says to his brothers. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. And then I just kept thinking about the ways in which God works and the way that he is, and how that is just totally separate from the way we are. And I don't mean separate, he uses us, but I mean as far as the way we think, the way we evaluate things. And it reminded me of the passage in Isaiah 55 that talks about God's ways being above our ways, his thoughts above our thoughts. And so let's look at that. Isaiah 55, um, not just verse 8 and 9, which I have paraphrased a little bit there for you, but let's look at 6 through 13 and just notice this is a section that talks about compassion. This is a passage that talks about God reaching out and caring about his people. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord, that he, the Lord, may have compassion on him, the one who is hopefully forsaking his ways and his thoughts. And to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. And this is an example here of parallelism. We have let him return to the Lord and to our God. Well, Lord and God, obviously the same, one and the same person. And then that he may have compassion on him and he will abundantly pardon. Those are in parallel with each other. When God has compassion, he pardons. When he pardons, he has compassion, etc., etc. So this is an admonition for someone who is wicked, someone who is unrighteous, to forsake those ways and those thoughts. And then it leads into the verses that we might be a little more familiar with. Why should he abandon his thoughts and his ways? Well, the Lord says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. And we have to see this working in the story of Joseph, the story of Esther, the story of Moses. We're going through on Sunday mornings at our congregation, Fishinger Road Church of Christ in Columbus, Ohio. We are going through a study on Sunday mornings of people who it looked bad for a stretch, but you know what? Things have gotten better. And God is the one with the right perspective. He's the one over all these things. It doesn't mean God wants bad things to happen to people. He certainly does not. But he works through them. And he knows about them ahead of time so that he can set things up to work through them. But again, God's ways are above our ways and his thoughts are above our thoughts. We don't have that perspective, and we don't have that way of seeing what is going to take place in life. And then this passage wraps up with 10 through 13. For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven, and do not return there, but water the earth, making it bring forth and sprout, giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater, God says, so shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose, and shall succeed in the thing for which I sent it. Now, there's a lot of depth to this word. God spoke this universe into existence. Jesus Christ is the living word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. A lot of depth here. When God speaks or when God purposes, things do take place, and God never fails. Verse 12, for you shall go out in joy and be led forth in peace. The mountains and the hills before you shall break forth into singing, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. Instead of the thorn shall come up the cypress. Instead of the brier shall come up the myrtle. And it shall make a name for the Lord, an everlasting sign that shall not be cut off. God accomplishes his purposes. God accomplished them in Joseph. God is accomplishing them as we go through the book in Esther. And of course, the ultimate example of him accomplishing his will is through Jesus Christ and the salvation that those of us in Christ are blessed to be a part of. All right, well, let's go through our text in Esther for today. First of all, we have these procedures, and they are unbelievable. These women are being prepared for like a year to be brought before King Ahasuerus and whoever the emperor might have been for these huge giant empires. This was probably pretty typical. We know that Daniel and his friends, and we'll look at the passage in a little bit, they were going through a 3-year preparation process to be the servants that they were called to be for Nebuchadnezzar. And so it's quite amazing the preparation, the details that these empires went into to prepare young people. And so this is happening in Daniel's case and his friends. Obviously, it was preparation for the males to serve in the way they were called to serve. In this case, it's much more specific. They are looking for a queen of the Persian Empire. And so this process is very specific to young ladies, virgins in particular, that will be either wives or concubines to King Ahasuerus. So we read last week how women were brought in from all over the empire. All right, so here's the procedure. Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women, when the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. So extremely interesting here that we have these women having the ability to take anything they want from the harem to head into the king's palace. And this is significant because Esther follows the advice of the eunuch in charge, and she does not try to put her own spin on her beauty, so to speak. So they've gone through the 12 months, they've gone through all these different things, and the young women could do whatever they wanted to make themselves ready or make themselves more beautiful, whatever the case may be, when they go into the king's palace. And then verse 14, in the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. Now, there is almost no doubt that there was sexual activity in this process, and the king would have, and we don't understand this culture, we don't understand this way of thinking, but these women, as you can see from the text here, once they go into the king, they become part of his group of concubines. And there is a eunuch in charge of them as well, Shashgaz, and they would go in to him. Again, this is something that we don't understand. It's not part of our culture really in any way. We probably do have men in our culture who are womanizers, as we might call them, or people who are just sexually promiscuous. We have men and women on both sides of that, but we do have men in our culture, I would say, who take pride in being able to accomplish sexual things as much as possible. This is one of the main goals of some people in our culture, and it's really a shame. For these people who were ruling empires and countries and things of this nature, the part of the job or part of the privilege, or however you want to word that, of course, we would not agree with this use of sexuality, but part of the process was, in all likelihood, that he would have sex with these women, and then they become part of his group. They become part of the women that he can, if he so chooses and so delights, he can call someone back. But they need to be summoned by name. We actually looked at this verse the very first week, I think, first or second week, to show the danger of going before the king. Definitely something that you don't just do lightly, and you don't disobey lightly, as Queen Vashti did when she didn't come into the king's banquet. I want us to just take a moment, though, to think about the preparation, and think about the preparation that went into preparing these women um, to go before this earthly king, and not even a godly king, just a pagan culture. And they went to great lengths to make preparation. Well, we're going to go before the king someday. And I think it's important for us to realize that we need to take seriously our preparation to go before the king. Now, the preparation from a spiritual standpoint has all been done by Jesus already. And so we live in response to that. And how much even more important, now that we've been saved, now that we are the bride of Christ, to do the appropriate things, to be ambassadors for Christ, to be, as the Persian Empire, they wanted a queen who they could put before people, and she was beautiful and she was great, and they wanted someone that they could um, show to the rest of the world. Well, Jesus is proud of us, as hard as it is for us to say that, because we know our sinfulness, but he has washed us clean and we are his bride. And so I want us to read just 4 verses from Revelation 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Any of us who have gotten married, if we're a guy, we have a little bit of a feel for what our wives did to get ready for the wedding. Usually there's a day, or maybe even in the morning of the wedding day, where they get their nails done and they get their hair done and they get makeup done and all these sorts of things. And of course, we're not talking 1 year of preparation like the situation with King Ahasuerus, but our wives go to great lengths. And if you are a woman listening to this, then you know exactly what you went through, if you ever had a wedding. And so we are the bride of Christ. The church is God's people. We are the bride of Jesus Christ. And it talks here about a bride adorned for her husband. So let's take seriously the way that we are, the way that we appear, the way in which we wear Jesus Christ. For we are to clothe ourselves with Christ. We are to be as much like him as we can possibly be. And then verses 3 and 4, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. So as these individuals pre-Christ time spent all this time preparing, let's make sure we prepare. Let's stay awake, so to speak, as it would be worded in Romans. It's time to wake up from our slumber. It's time for us to be serious about what is to come. All right, so now we go to verses 15 through 18, and now it is Esther's turn to go in before King Ahasuerus. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, when it came time for her to go in to the king, She asked for nothing. They could take anything they wanted, but she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had the charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. All right, so the booklet makes a good point. Esther, and I'm not sure, we can't know positively that this is exactly what was happening here, but Haggai may have known the king's preferences. He may have known, hey, this is what the king would like best. But in any event, Haggai obviously gave good advice, and Esther was wise to allow him to choose what to do. And I just think Esther, we can't know anything that was in the minds of these individuals unless we are told by the text. But I take this as an indication that Esther was very humble, that she, if she became queen, she became queen. If she did not become queen, she did not become queen. I don't think Esther was too wrapped up, because we don't know yet that she's going to need to be queen to save the people, and she would not know this yet. But whatever happens will happen. I think Esther, no matter what happened, was going to continue to be a faithful Jewish young woman. And so now it is her turn. She has found favor in all these people's eyes, including Haggai. He gives her the special group of women to help her get through this year. And she had that special group really pretty much the whole year. We get the indication right away. She was noticed right away. Haggai helped with giving her basically a staff. And so, anyway, here she goes. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, so we're given very detailed facts about when she went in. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. All right, so Esther is now queen. As we go through the text, Esther chapter 2, verse 17, Esther is queen. And so here we go, really. This now starts the part of the story where her role is going to be super important. And so we led up to this point. All really the text in chapter 1 and chapter 2 up to this point was to lead us to this point, to get us to the point, to understand how this all took place. And now Esther is the queen. People are skeptical about the word loved, but this is the word of God. And yes, it could have been sexual love, but I think it's more than that. I think he saw in Esther the person who needed to be queen of the empire of Persia, and not just the one who was the best looking, although I'm sure that was a part of it. In fact, we know that was a part of it. But she won grace and favor in his sight. It's not just that he thought she was beautiful. She won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So really, really, I mean, this is a pivotal moment for the history of the Jews, and amazing, absolutely incredible. And one more verse for this section. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. And it's pointed out in the booklet, and I think this is appropriate. This was Esther's feast. She was being honored in this case. And whether or not Vashti would have been honored if she would have gone into the feast in chapter 1, we assume she would not have been honored, that it would have just been a figurehead kind of, or maybe even worse, of here's the beautiful queen parading herself into the room. We just don't know. We don't know all the dynamics of that, but this seems to be a feast of honor. And he was very generous. He was very, very kind to the people, his officials, and the whole empire. Now that there is a new queen on the queen's throne, we will say. And here's where I want to share with you a little bit of the book of Daniel. Just again, noting that the the that all of us who are God's people, if we're put in a difficult situation, we can stay faithful. Really, is what this is getting to. This is right at the beginning of the book of Daniel. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these, and just notice 3 years, this prep time should be a great lesson for us to take seriously our preparation for all sorts of things in life, especially spiritual things. But sometimes you'll see a little snippet online in social media that says, the person you want to be in a year or two, it starts today. And that's true. We have to do the things today to lead us to be the people that we want to be in the future. And these people of Mesopotamia, in the time of Daniel and then later in the time of Esther, they got it. They understood this. 1 year to prepare these women, 3 years to prepare these young men. And verse 6, among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. And that's how we kind of know them. We don't know Daniel by his Babylonian name, but we do know Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego by those names. Daniel, we continue to call Daniel as we go through the book. All right, let's look at our last section of today's lesson from Esther. A plot against the king. Esther chapter 2, verses 19 to 23. Now, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. And this is an interesting statement. People differ on what they think it means. This could be the virgins who did not become queen. It could just be that group. And why gathered together the second time, we just don't really know. Other people think more virgins had come in from around the empire, and they were just being gathered, and they were going to start the process of beautification. The king was not going to stop having concubines. We can be assured of that, and probably other wives. But whatever this gathering is, there are more virgins being gathered, and Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Verse 20. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. So there's just a note still that no one knows that she's a Jew, and her obedience to Mordecai, who raised her, who became her dad, basically. And she was very obedient to him, which is, of course, appropriate. So in those days, verse 21, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So we're not told why, but they are angry and they want to hurt the king. Lay hands on King Ahasuerus. I mean, if you're going to attack the king, you better kill him, right? Because otherwise you're going to be killed. So we have to assume that they laying hands on him just didn't mean that they wanted to beat him up. I think we can assume that they wanted to kill the king. And so we continue on here. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. All right, so this is obviously a big deal. Mordecai uncovers this plot. He tells Esther. Esther tells the king in the name of Mordecai. So Mordecai's name is being written in this book of the Chronicles, and noted. And so this will be important later. It's interesting that they had their so-called CSI or their FBI or whatever we might want to call it, but it was investigated and it was found to be so. And so these men, of course, were killed. They were hanged on the gallows. And again, an important note is that it was recorded, and it was recorded in the presence of the king. And so he knows about this. Obviously, if there's a plot against you and you are in a position as King Ahasuerus was in, you're going to want to make sure everything is recorded correctly, and you're going to take note and pay attention to what happens. All right, let's take a look at the applications for today. There are 3 again for today. The text provides no details of what Esther and the other women endured at the hands of Ahasuerus. We assume the king, whose previous actions emphasize his lack of morality, gratified his desires with each potential suitor. We also know that Esther was taken to the king's palace when the selection process began, likely indicating that she had little choice in the matter. Regardless, God's unseen hand protected Esther and guided her throughout the process. Esther seemingly stole the heart of the pagan king, who hosted a feast to honor his new bride. By doing so, he treated her differently than he did his former queen. And yeah, we don't have details of what was in his heart, what was in his mind concerning these things, but obviously Esther, the text says he loved her. Whatever level of love we might want to place on that. But he definitely was taken by Esther and definitely wanted her to be queen, and she is now the queen. It is just a whole different culture. I don't think any of the women had a choice. I don't think people were able to line up. That we were given no indication people could just come and say, yeah, I want to be taken care of for a whole year in the palace, and all the privileges of I don't think any woman got to choose that. I think they went out and found the beautiful virgins in the empire, and they were the ones who chose and brought them to the palace. So I don't think there's any doubt that any of these women had a choice in the matter. I don't think that was the case. But we could be shocked someday if we find out something differently. All right, application 2. Evidence of God's providential involvement in the story of Esther is scattered throughout the book. From Ahasuerus' decision to remove Vashti as queen to Esther's selection as her replacement, God was at work. His actions are also seen in Mordecai's discovery and revelation of the plot to harm King Ahasuerus. Because he revealed the potential threat to Esther and was credited with so doing, he was later honored for his actions. Esther 6:11. King Ahasuerus came to view Mordecai in a positive light, an opinion his close advisor, Haman, certainly did not share. So, and of course, that's going to come to its head as we move through the book. And then the final application for this lesson: Esther's hesitancy to reveal her ethnicity is emphasized in the account. And that's true. We've seen that more than once already. This was true before she was chosen as queen, and it remained true afterward. It is possible Mordecai advised her to keep her background a secret because he was aware of racial prejudices within the king's inner circle. And we talked about some of the possibilities that he would have done that last week and the week before. But given the way Haman later attempted to exterminate the Jews and the initial lack of concern shown by King Ahasuerus when he was presented with Haman's proposal, it seems Mordecai's approach was justified. Esther kept the secret as long as she could. Consequently, she alone was in a position to act on behalf of her people. And of course, that is huge. She was able to save the Jewish people. All right. There are 4 discussion questions for this week's lesson. And as always, I'll just encourage you to pause the video. If you're with someone else, you can discuss them together, or you can just hear them as I read them out and let them prompt your thinking in any way you would like. But here are the 4 discussion questions for this lesson. In what way or ways do we see God at work behind the scenes in Esther's story? Number 2, why is it easier to see God's involvement in the past than in the present? I think that's an interesting one. Number 3, how does King Ahasuerus change throughout the book of Esther? And then number 4, what does this text teach us about the prevalence of sexual immorality in the ancient world? What passages stress the importance of sexual purity? And this is an interesting question, and we've touched on it several different times over the last several weeks. And it's the culture was. I'm not making excuses. God had a plan for sexuality. It was between a man and his wife, and we find out in the New Testament, especially, it was meant to be one man with one wife, one man, one woman, and so but God allowed these crazy situations. Solomon had hundreds of wives and concubines, and it just seems that this was the way of a king, the way of an emperor, and as terrible as that would be, but definitely things were different than they are today. Although I'm sure we have some places in the world today where a a tribal chief or a king or that people take advantage of their power for sexual purposes. But um, we know that King Ahasuerus was involved in having many concubines and was not true to one woman. So that we can know for sure, and that would obviously not be according to God's plan. We want to be sexually appropriate in our lives as we are ambassadors for Christ, as we live for Him. We want to make sure that we do stick with what the Bible talks about concerning sexual morality and sexual immorality. The book of Corinthians talks a lot about that. It was just not appropriate for people in the church, people part of God's family, to be inappropriate in these ways. All right, next week we dive into chapter 3. We'll look at verses 1 through 11. And the title for next week's lesson is The Advancement of Haman. So our antagonist of the story will come to light next week as we look at this text. May the Lord continue to bless us and keep us as we study His amazing word.